So we've got a new direction, a new decoration here in the sanctuary. People are looking at it. I'm just going to leave you curious about it for a few minutes. I'll explain it. Don't worry. We are, again, in the first Sunday of Lent, kind of a reflective season. A lot of people give things up or take on new practices that they want to incorporate in their lives. We invite you to explore that as much as you would like. I'm going to open today with a poem by the Reverend Sarah Speed called "Who Will You Listen To?" Thinking of the various voices that call us to ourselves or away from ourselves. Who will you listen to? Twitter or the BBC? The ads on late-night television? The wind as she blows? The echo of children playing? Oh, so well-timed. The quiet of snow? The ice bucket challenge? The phone when it rings? Your pastor? Your mother? Your doctor? Your gut? The tension in your shoulders? The restaurant singing happy birthday? Audiobooks, TED Talks, the rhythm of the music, the coffee drip in the morning, your therapist, the wisdom of the Enneagram. You can look that up if you don't know what it is. The way your heart comes alive when you're being creative, the man on the corner asking for change, the kid on the subway selling chocolate, the labels on the makeup bottle that promise timeless beauty, the magazines that tell you you need timeless beauty, astrology, the Dow Jones, the hiss of the radiator, the pitter-patter of little feet, financial advisors, the top 40 pop, the top 40 country, the New York Times, the rumor mill, the book of Psalms, your sense of self, Jesus when he says, I am with you always. A list poem. The assigned Bible reading for this morning, I opted for the First Testament. This comes from Genesis. This is part of, an excerpt of one of the two creation stories in Genesis. We get to the point of the story where there are human beings. Parts of Genesis chapter 2 and chapter 3. I'm using a translation by the Bible scholar Wilda Gaffney, who notices that the story begins when there's only one human, and so better to think of it as non-gendered or all-gendered. We'll hear it. The sovereign God crafted the human from the dust of the humus. She's playing up the word play that's in the Hebrew as well. The Hebrew terms, the human is made out of the humus, the earth. The sovereign God crafted the human from the dust of the humus and breathed into its nostrils the breath of life, and the human became a living soul. And the sovereign God planted a garden in Eden in the east, and there placed the human whom God had formed. Out of the ground, the sovereign God made grow every tree pleasant to the sight and good for food, and the tree of life in the middle of the garden, along with the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The sovereign God took the human and settled it in the Garden of Eden to till it and tend it. And then the sovereign God commanded the human, from every tree of the garden you may eat freely, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day you eat from it, you shall surely die. God's a buzzkill. Now the serpent had more naked intelligence, and this is also an interesting term. It's crafty is the way, the serpent is more crafty is how it's usually translated. But the Hebrew term, and don't let me convince you that I'm a Hebrew expert. I just share these things that I read from Hebrew experts. The Hebrew term there, arum, sounds like arum, which is the word for naked, which comes later in the story. So she notices this pun, this wordplay, and makes the serpent the most nakedly intelligent. The serpent had more naked intelligence than any other animal of the field that the sovereign God made. And it said to the woman, because we skipped over the whole part of the story where God realized the human shouldn't be alone when everything else has companions, and split the human in two. Often the English says took a rib out, but the Will Gaffney says actually, and other commentaries I've read say actually it's more like take the side off of. So it's like a cleaving in two, less hierarchical than it usually comes out. So now there are two. Now the serpent had more naked intelligence than any other animal of the field that God had made, and it said to the woman, "Oh, indeed, did God say you two shall not eat from any tree in the garden?" The woman said to the serpent, "From the fruit of any tree in the garden we may eat, though the fruit of the tree in the middle of the garden, God said, you two shall not eat it and shall not touch it, lest you two die." Then the serpent said to the woman, "You two will certainly not die. For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you two will be like God, knowing good and evil." So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eye, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. And she also gave some to her man who was with her, and he ate. Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they knew they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made loincloths for themselves. They heard the sound of the sovereign God walking in the garden at the time of the evening breeze, and the man and woman hid themselves from the presence of the sovereign God among the trees of the garden. They were embarrassed. When I was young and my body worked more or less the way that I wanted it to, when I could just go out and run, without having to do a conscious check-in with my muscles and my joints and my ligaments to see if all three were going to give me permission. It's very rare that they do that anymore. I like to feel the air around me. In my hair when I had it, underneath me, high jump, triple jump, sprints. These are the things that I did with my track and field team in high school. I will never forget one meet that we had. It was a home meet at my school. It was either my junior or my senior year. The last two events of the day were both relays that I was running. And it had been a full day. I had jumped long, I had jumped high, I did the individual sprints, and then closed out with the 4x100 meter relay. So run as fast as you can for 100 meters. And then I was also in the 4x400 meter relay. I ran hard. The team did well. We were all pretty happy with ourselves. The meet was over. It was time to get ready to go home, start on homework. My body felt spent. It was the kind of spent that said you had done everything that you could. You didn't leave anything out there. It was time to go home. So I started changing from my uniform back into my street clothes. I'm standing there with my shorts in my hand when my friend Chris said, "Kipp, what are you doing?" I had forgotten the part where you go into the locker room first. Still outside. It was not quite Adam and Eve level, but I can relate to their moment of panic. Do you know that feeling of being exposed, feeling vulnerable, being seen in a way that you hadn't intended? The other story that I could have told was the emotional vulnerability of the secret admirer letter I wrote one time, coded my name but poorly, and then dropped it in the wrong person's locker. That was also feeling naked and exposed and vulnerable, seen in a way that you didn't intend. How do you tend to respond when you find yourself in that space? That's one question that we could sit with from today's Bible reading. The story is familiar, but less familiar than you think when you actually look at it and read it with fresh eyes. But it's ambitious. It's also ambiguous. It's meant to explain why things are the way they are, but it raises more questions than it gives answers. And it's been made to carry a lot of weight that it doesn't need to carry and shouldn't be carrying. It's one of those stories that if you tell it to yourself from memory and then go back and actually read it, you'll notice some things that are there that you didn't think were there, and some things that aren't there that you were positive were there. Like the whole apple thing. No apple. Jewish commentary says it's a fig. They figure it's a fig because they sowed fig trees to themselves. But it doesn't say either way. Christian interpretation as early as Paul in some of the New Testament writings analyzes it with the language of sin. And by the 5th century, remember Paul was deeply trained within a school of Judaism, so it's not just a Christian invention to put sin on this, but by the 5th century, it had developed into a whole doctrine called original sin to tell us why we're all just horrible from the moment that we're born. But if we take the story on its own terms, it doesn't actually use that language at all. The terminology of sin isn't in there anywhere. It doesn't say that death is a punishment, which is also something that we have absorbed from it. And it does paint a picture of a God who is kind of learning as God goes along as well. Kind of like parents do. I mean, heck, maybe even God made that classic quip somewhere along the way about how being a parent doesn't come with a manual, or maybe God said it as a humanual. Sorry, not sorry. Yeah. Really, it's a story that holds both comedy and tragedy. The human is still singular when God puts them in charge of caring for the garden. And right there in the middle, in the prime real estate of the garden, God points out 2 trees that God had put there, remember. Says that one of those 2 trees is out of bounds for eating. So why was it there? Surely one might expect that the God who created it all could have opted for some different sort of gardening arrangement. Surely one might expect that God could have anticipated the Russian playwright Anton Chekhov's principle that, this is what Chekhov said about plays. He said, if in the first act you've hung a pistol on the wall, then in the following one it should be fired. Surely God should have known that putting a tree in the middle of the garden and saying, don't eat this one thing, meant that that's the thing they were going to eat. But maybe God hadn't got that far yet. After all, this was God's first human. Part of the story that we skipped says that God realized it wasn't good for the human to be without a partner, so they created all the different animals for them to see if any one of them could be their equal partner. Let's see, what can help the human with the caretaking work in the garden and be a worthy companion for them. God went through all the possibilities: aardvark, platypus, tapeworm, serpent, elephant, dog. Oh, we're getting closer here. Cat, probably not, but make it anyway. I'm adding things to the story as well. Before finally realizing, the human needs another human. It took God a lot of work to get to that point in the story, splitting them in 2. The story doesn't say where evil comes from. We try to make it say that. It doesn't tell us where death comes from. We try to make it say that. It features a talking snake that Christians have identified as the devil, but the story doesn't actually make that identification. It says the serpent is one of the creatures that God made the most crafty, or the one with the most naked intelligence. It came along and asked about that tree in the middle of the garden that the humans were guaranteed to eat from, right? Did God say, you'll die if you eat that? You won't die. It will open your eyes. So the woman took a bite, and she didn't die. And the man took a bite, and he didn't die. The snake was right. But he hadn't shared the whole truth. He had said to them, God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. And the story itself says that is what happened. It puts that assessment in God's own mouth. Humanity has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. But there was a trade-off. They'd gained new insight, but it made them see themselves differently as well. They saw their vulnerability. They felt exposed. They stood there and figured out how to turn fig leaves into track shorts. It's a dangerous thing, potentially, for humans to have God-like knowledge. That seems to be something the story does suggest. At least it seems like something that God was afraid of. The story ends with God sending the humans packing because they had attained God-like knowledge from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And God didn't want to take the chance that these newly knowledgeable beings might also eat from the tree of life and live forever. So yeah, it's not where death came from. There is a tragic truth to the story. The long history of humanity is that, yes, our knowledge has not saved us. Cheapo Exhibit A, the internet. Bottomless knowledge at our fingertips has not led us to utopia. I don't know if anyone else shares that assessment with me or not. We are still outside of Eden. Contrary to how it often gets told, though, God did not curse humans in the story, but God did say that the earth would be cursed because of them, or the ground would be cursed because of them. It's hard to look at where our economic systems have led us these days and conclude otherwise. The serpent was right about their eyes being opened, but it neglected to say that the knowledge came at a cost. This maybe is a story of human adolescence, right? Gaining things, but also losing things in the process. The humans became aware of their vulnerability and maybe aware of their own power, and that caused them to act irrationally. I mean, they hid from God because they knew that they were naked, as if God hadn't already known that. God wasn't seeing anything new. And then they started to throw around blame because that feeling of vulnerability is uncomfortable. The woman blamed the serpent, the man blamed the woman, and sideways blamed God. This woman whom you gave to be with me, she gave me the fruit, even though he'd been standing right there the whole time, also, again, according to the story. The new vision and the new knowledge, it gave them power that they didn't know what to do with, and it gave them insecurity that made them lash out. What might it have been like to instead just sit with the discomfort of that vulnerability? How might the story have been different if they didn't let fear drive their response? If I'd read, instead of reading this one, if I'd read the gospel story that always gets assigned for the first Sunday of Lent, we'd have heard about Jesus out in the wilderness 40 days in a state of profound exposure and vulnerability as it happens, isolated and fasting, alone, hungry, thirsty for a long time. And a conversation partner shows up to him when he's in this state, not a talking snake. This time the story actually does identify it as a devil, encouraging him to tap into his inner powers in ways that would sell himself short. Just turn these stones into bread. Jump from the temple. Test God. Show how powerful you are. It's a whole series of temptations. And each time, Jesus, very vulnerable in this state, responds with integrity instead of acting out of fear or insecurity. Oh, I am hungry. Maybe I should just turn stones into bread. His vulnerability instead becomes an openness to God that enables him to be open to others instead of being something that makes him lash out. This is what I want to sit with this morning, or invite us to sit with. How do you respond when you feel vulnerable, when you feel exposed? What are the challenges? What are the invitations of it? In this season, again, Lent is a season of reflection. And once again, we're drawing on materials from Sanctified Art. The theme that they have chosen for the season is seeking, which suggests that we're on a search for something. I won't tell you what you should be seeking or how you should think about the search in this season. Maybe for you, this will be a season of seeking your way back to yourself. Maybe it's seeking a fuller sense of God in your life. Maybe it's seeking what comes next for you. But our spiritual life committee wanted to invite us to help create something that would reflect our communal journey over the next several weeks. So we've got here in the sanctuary a collection of branches that will turn into a tree or a shrubbery. They're not quite as large as a tree. And maybe the tree of life or our tree of the knowledge of good and evil. I don't know. I don't want to get us in trouble with with anyone here. Maybe just a tree of questions, a tree of inspirations, a tree of our life together. There are leaves here in the pews if you're here in the sanctuary with us. If you're online, we'll invite you to put things in the chat. I'll explain it in a moment. And someone will write on leaves and hang them for you as well. They're just branches. Rachel has created these leaves. Terry might have helped cut them out too. Okay. All right. I don't want to steal. I want to make sure everybody got credit. But find a leaf near you and write something on it. What to write? That's a good question. Maybe you've got a question that you're wrestling with, one that helps you seek after meaning, or maybe you'll want to write down what you're most in need of and hang it on the tree like a prayer. Or maybe for today, I'll suggest this one, because this first Sunday of Lent holds two different stories of vulnerability. Adam and Eve's vulnerability led them into some destructive reactivity. Jesus' vulnerability leaves him open to the prompts of the Spirit in his life. So maybe today I'll invite you to write down something that calls you into being your best self. And then as we get to, when we're at the offering period and Jaime is playing the offertory, I'll invite you to come and hang it on the tree. And Jaime, if there's something that you want to write and hang on the tree, we'll make sure that we get it from you as well, so that it be added to the tree. And again, folks on Zoom, you can put it in the chat, and we'll make sure that your thoughts get hung on the tree. Or the shrubbery, the shrubbery of life, or the shrubbery of the knowledge of good and evil. Again, we'll figure out what it is as we go throughout Lent. But that's God's good news, is that we've got questions, we've got things that call to us. We are all vulnerable, and that vulnerability can call us in different directions. It's God's good news.